So, I just watched this documentary from 2013, and I really, really loved it, and now I want to talk about it, because why the fuck not? So let's do a little bit of a review. And of course, this video is about Jodorowsky's Dune. And of course, I've been in a Dune craze lately. I watched the newest movie from Denis Villeneuve, which I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite movies ever. I love Denis' Dune movies. I even enjoy David Lynch's Dune movie. I have read the books. I love the books. And I have just been in an absolute craze for Dune. I've been taking every little bit of information in the Dune universe I can get and just been embracing it all. And now I've watched this documentary about this filmmaker, Alejandro Jodorowsky, who I'm going to be completely honest with you, I have never even heard of, but he was this Chilean-French filmmaker who decided that he wanted to make a film adaptation of Dune all the way back in the 1970s. And this documentary essentially outlines what his plan was for that film, how he was building that film, and why the film ultimately did not happen, and what had become of his work. And this documentary is fascinating for a multitude of reasons, because it is an inside view of the development process, at least back in the 1970s, for a major sci-fi blockbuster like this. What kind of work was put in to the art, to the special effects. It's also an insight into a filmmaker who has a very unique mindset when it comes to the industry. This guy is a filmmaker. He's somebody who believes very, very wholeheartedly in the art of film. He believes in taking the dream in your mind, the idea of the story and the world in your mind, and putting it to screen. He doesn't care about the money. He doesn't care about anything else. He is just in it to tell visual stories that are interesting, pleasing, and entertaining for audiences, and that is what this man was. And watching him in that process develop this extremely larger-than-life story, this story that is both brilliant as a novel, but just so invigorating when it comes to a philosophical stance, is so fascinating, and his ideas for it, and the artist that he was working with, and how big of scope and scale this film went to, and then what Hollywood decided to do with it. It's a crazy film. So just to give you a setup for this movie, Alejandro Jodorowsky at the time in the 1970s was an up-and-coming, he was a pretty great filmmaker at the time. He had made 2 movies that were extremely well accepted. He had made one movie that was one of the biggest films in Europe at the time, outside of like the James Bond films. And his producing partner that he worked with pretty much told him, I want to make a film with you and we can make whatever the hell you want. Like, blank check, make whatever you want because we have all the faith in the world in you. And he said, I want to make Dune. And at the time, he had never even read Dune, which is hilarious to me. But he had heard so much about it, and he was fascinated by the idea of it. So his producer partner went out and he bought the film rights for Dune, which were hilariously cheap, and they started developing this movie. He had written a script that was very, very different from the book, but still followed kind of the concepts that Frank Herbert had laid out. And he essentially wanted to create the greatest sci-fi movie ever. He wanted to create the next 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie that would change the film industry and literally be the biggest thing ever. So he starts bringing in all these people, these different teams, to start creating art for the film. I'm going to show you some of the art now on the screen. The art for the ships, the landscapes, the sets. And this is really what this documentary is all about. It's showing you the concept art that was created for this film. And you could see that this film, which he describes in the movie as being almost an LSD trip without the LSD. Kind of these extremely weird images of how the ships are built, the costumes, the colors. It is such a different interpretation of the material than something like Denis did, or even what David Lynch did. It is so crazy and so abundantly clear that this movie was going to be something that at the time had never been done before. And he had brought in special effects artists who had gotten the exact ideas of how they were going to build out sets, how they were going to film everything. And listening to Jodorowsky talk about his filmmaking process, like he described the opening shot of his Dune movie, what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be this one long take that started outside the galaxy and slowly creeped in, and you saw all these different visuals. You see stars colliding, planets exploding, meteors passing, all of this stuff as you slowly come up until Arrakis, and you get to Arrakis and you close in on them transporting spice. And it's supposed to be this one big long shot. He took inspiration from an Orson Welles movie, and the way he describes it sounded so brilliant. It's something we've seen before, and they show you at the end of the movie that idea had been used after this. Movies like Robert Zemeckis' Contact, a movie that I love, but it does that same thing. And we've seen that shot used now a billion times, but at the time, this was something that had never been done. And people were reading this and they go, one continuous shot through a fucking galaxy. How are you going to do that? But he had the idea. He knew how he was going to do it, and it was so interesting. And he had a bunch of different sequences mapped out for the film. Some of which, as somebody who loves Dune and loves the story, are kind of fucking stupid. Like, the conception of Paul Atreides, there's a whole idea of how Paul was going to be made. So in the books and in the movies, they don't show you. Paul's just there already. But in Jodorowsky's Dune, the way it was going to work is that Duke Leto could not have kids, right? He just couldn't produce kids. So what Lady Jessica would do instead is she would take a little bit of blood from Duke Leto and she would put it in her, her thingamajig, and then, boom! Paul Atreides. He's birthed from blood. And I remember hearing that and thinking, what the fuck? That is insane. But then Jodorowsky starts explaining. He goes, oh, it's because Paul, he's not supposed to be born of the desires of sex and all this stuff. He's born of something else, something stronger. And it's like, fuck it. You got me believing, man. I don't know how Frank Herbert would feel about that, but that's... fuck it, who cares? And there's a lot of differences. Like, the whole ending of this movie is very different. Like, that Paul was going to die. He would lose his fight with Fade Rotha, but he would essentially become the Messiah officially when he died. Like, in the movie Dune, the newest one, there's a part where Florence Pugh's Princess Irulan says something like, if you kill him, you cannot kill him. A Messiah, a religious figure, he gets stronger when he dies. You will make a martyr. And this movie kind of would have studied that reality, where Paul dies at the end. Muad'Dib dies, and all of the Fremen and all of his family go, no, we are all Paul Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib lives within all of us, and it creates something stronger almost, and then the planet becomes a green-blue paradise, like, immediately, which sort of kind of happens in the David Lynch one as well. It's really stupid. But either way, that was supposed to be the ending, and a part of me watching this documentary was like, I don't think he understood the book, like, at all. But then another part of me was like, maybe I didn't understand the book, and he was trying to go a different perspective of that? Or maybe none of us understand the book, right? How about that? There's an interesting difference in how each movie and each thing approaches it. Same with this. This is probably the most unique and brutal and out there version of it. Like, in the book, as bad as Vladimir Harkonnen is, like, he's still a dick, there's, like, a sense of honor in how he treats Duke Leto. He's like, I don't want to be that much of a dick. Like, I'm going to kill you. I did all this shit to you, but I'm not gonna, like, embarrass you. Like, I'm not that big of a dick. And then, of course, in the Denis movies, he's got him stripped naked. He's eating over his, like, lifeless body. He's a douche. In Jodorowsky's Dune, I mean, they fucking rip him apart, limb for limb, and torture him to death. That's insane. Jodorowsky had also all these ideas of how each, like, planet would be played in by a different band, like, Duke Leto and his whole group, and Paul and the Atreides, their theme would be played by Pink Floyd, and the Harkonnens would be played by a different band, and each kind of, like, iteration of people would have their own thing. And to me, I just kept hearing this and going, this movie was going to cost $1 billion to make. Because then he talks about who's going to play Baron Harkonnen. Orson Welles is going to play Baron Harkonnen. I'm like, what the... That would have been so good. That would have been the greatest thing ever. Mick Jagger was going to play Fade Rotha. Like, there were just so many casting ideas. His kid was going to play Paul. Probably the least interesting casting choice of the whole thing. But this man just had, like, the greatest plan ever. He had a book that explained everything. It had all the concept art, the script. It had how much it was going to cost, who was going to be involved. Apparently, the cost was manageable. He had the whole pitch. Everything was ready to go. It was going to be a long-ass movie. He brings it to Hollywood, and they said, this isn't going to make us that much money. Probably. We don't want it. We want... Bring us Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker. That'll make us money. That's not what they said. But they pretty much said, fuck you. Because the Hollywood, the producers, the people that pitch, if you guys don't know how the industry works, you have creators, you have artists, right? You have filmmakers, writers, a lot of which are people like Jodorowsky, like Quentin Tarantino, like Christopher Nolan. People that just want to make great movies and tell great stories. They don't really give a shit about anything else that happens in the industry. You have actors who just want to act. They want to do their craft and tell great stories. Then you have producers who don't give a fuck about film. Let's just be real. Most of them, a lot of them, and I'm sure there's good ones out there, but a lot of the people that work at the top of Hollywood, a lot of, like, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, are just absolute slime bags that do not care about film as an art. They care about film as a business, which is fine. I understand it. That's the way our world works. You cannot hate the players of the game. You hate the game itself. We live in a world that's ran by money, and that's how the top of Hollywood is ran. It's ran by people who want only to make money, and they don't give a shit how they do it, and they don't give a shit how bad they hurt the industry by doing it. Hence the Star Wars sequels. Hence modern Hollywood, which has been watered down a lot. But because he was presenting this film, it was something that had never been made before. It was a big risk. It was the biggest sci-fi movie ever. It was so out there. Like I said before, it was an LSD trip without the LSD. It was a director who had never made a film like this. It was a massive, massive, massive risk. So the studios said, no. No thank you, we're okay. And the movie was never made. Instead, the project ended up going to another director. It went to David Lynch, who is another great visionary director. And you know the story of David Lynch's Dune. He made the movie. He didn't get final cut. They ended up creating something that wasn't his film. He was very, very upset about it, said it was the worst experience of his life, and we got a movie that was a pile of shit. There's a really fun part of this movie where Jodorowsky talks about when he went to go see David Lynch's Dune, and he was so afraid because he loved David Lynch, and he knew how great of a filmmaker David Lynch was, and he just thought, wow, he's going to make my movie, and he's probably going to do it better than I ever would have done it. He was so sick, he just didn't even want to look at it, and he warriored up, and he said, fine, let's go watch the movie. And he goes, within 40 minutes, with 30 minutes, within a little bit into the movie, I got so happy. I got overjoyed. I was smiling. I was cheering. Because all I was thinking is, this fucking sucks. It's terrible. Hooray. They made a stinker. Let's go. That made me laugh so hard. That's like the most human reaction possible. That he put all this energy into making this film, and Hollywood said, no, we don't want you making it. We're going to have somebody else make it. We're going to bring in David Lynch, and the movie still ends up being shit. And it ends up being shit, not because of Jodorowsky, it ends up being shit because of the studio, the producers. That's why the movie ended up being bad, and that's why modern Dune ended up being great, because they let Denis Villeneuve, who is a visionary filmmaker, make the movie he wanted to make. So maybe Hollywood's learned its lesson, at least with the Dune property. But it is such an interesting study, and it's an interesting study to show all the visual artists that worked on this film as they went off to work on other stuff, and how images and stuff from this film, from the work that Jodorowsky did on this, ended up in other things, like in Alien, like in Contact, like we talked about. Of course, Star Wars. I mean, George Lucas essentially took Dune, the Dune story, and use that as a mold for Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars is very, very similar to Dune in a lot of ways, the book, and visually there are callbacks to a lot of the concept art that was created in this. Not saying George Lucas stole Jodorowsky's idea. I would never say that. George Lucas, I love George Lucas. But there are just a lot of echoes of the work that he had done in the concept of this film that showed up in many other science fiction movies going forward. And it is a fascinating thing to think about what film would look like, what the world would look like if this movie was made. If this movie had come out before Star Wars, it had been a hit, because he was making this film, I believe, in 1975, which is before A New Hope came out. If this film had been made and came out before Star Wars, would Dune have been that big franchise? Would you have seen a Dune Messiah back in the 70s? Would you have seen a Children of Dune movie and had all of these books adapted? And would you have seen in 2015, with all these movies being done, like a new sequel trilogy directed by J.J. Abrams, produced by Kathleen Kennedy, called Dune: The Spice Awakens, where a girl named, like, Shay or something has to go to Arrakis and, learn to be a Fremen and ride a sandworm and do everything that Paul did and just do it again. But a woman this time. I don't know. Maybe that would be the world we're living in. Maybe Star Wars would have never blown up. Or maybe this movie would have been made and it would have been just as big of a stinker as Dune, David Lynch's was. Would we have ever gotten Denis Villeneuve's Dune movies that are now just so incredible and are now creating the modern franchise of Dune that I think we're probably going to see over the next decade or two? What would cinema as a whole look like? What would Jodorowsky's career look like? Because if he had made this movie and it had been a monster hit, this might have been one of the biggest names in film, in cinema. This might be a name that would have been iconic when it comes to film if this movie had been made. There are just so many questions around the ifs, the ends. And I understand why the film wasn't made from a business standpoint. It was a big risk. This is going to be like a 3.5-hour movie. It was going to be an epic sci-fi film of proportions that Hollywood had never seen at the time. It was not a film that was presented to younger or family audiences, because it's a film that was going to be brutal. Duke Leto getting torn apart. Lady Jessica putting blood in her thing, in her vagina, having blood sex or something. Crazy. It was going to be a colorful, weird, slow burn, just thriller, and it was just never going to work the way that Star Wars worked. Star Wars was a pretty simple but pretty explosive adventure story that resonated with kids and adults. It was a story that was easily presentable, so you can understand why that film was easier for the business of film to say, hey, that is marketable. Dune, not so marketable. You could even see in Denis' films that this is not a film that's easy to present to audiences. There is so much philosophical bullshit in Dune that it's hard to present it, the lore, the world, to audiences and get them to connect with it. Because, like, even in the basic hero story that it presents, it ain't a basic hero story. There's a turn with Paul Atreides and understanding what his character actually means. And although Jodorowsky was not going to go that direction with the character, he was going to go in a completely different direction that diverted from the books, still adapting this story is very, very, very difficult to sell, so I understand why the business rejected it. But it's such an interesting documentary, both on the insight of the creation of film, something that was very unique and very informative for somebody like me who wants to work in film, but also it was just interesting to think about the butterfly effect of this movie not being made and what would have happened if it had been made. And it's just an interesting conversation, an interesting dialogue that you guys should continue in the comments. Please go ahead, let me know what you thought of this documentary. Let me know what you think of the unmade Dune film. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe, turn on notifications to see more of my stuff. Make sure to click the video that's going to be on your screen in about a second, and I will see you guys in the next one.